The mysterious passenger with wine-stained hands you are on a slow-moving ship somewhere in the Aegean. The sails creak with the gentlest whisper of wind, and the sun gleams golden on the sea. You are not a pirateless, make that clear, but the men around you, rough-skinned and salt-dusted, most certainly are. They speak in low tones and shift their weight often, as if unsure whether the cargo in their hold or the passenger on deck is worth the trouble. You sit, tucked in a corner, watching him. The man, he has the look of someone who doesn't quite belong. Draped in a cloak to clean, sandals too soft for sea travel. His hair is curled in lazy spirals, dampened by sea mist and something sweet-smelling like grapes. He leans on the railing as though the boat were a chaise lounge in a marble courtyard. You've seen plenty of merchants and wanderers, but none who smile so serenely at the waves, as though he knows what they're planning. That man, as you'll later realize, is Dionysus. And this is the beginning of a very strange day at sea. Let's step back. Who exactly was Dionysus, and what was he doing on a pirate ship? Dionysus, also called Bacchus by the Romans, is often dismissed as the god of wine and merrimenter, sort of divine party planner. But in the earliest myths, he was far more complex. He was a wanderer, a foreigner even among gods. His cult spread through whispers and wild rituals carried by mystery and grapevines. He was a god of masks, of transformation, of letting go, and his stories are often less about drunken joy than about what happens when order dissolves. Born to Semele, a mortal woman, and Zeus, Dionysus had a troubled childhood. Hera, queen of the gods and serial grudge holder, tricked Semele into demanding to see Zeus in his true, divine form, an act that incinerated her on the spot. Zeus saved the fetus and stitched it into his own thigh, later giving birth to Dionysus, in a thunderous act of leg-based divine biology. As a result, Dionysus grew up hiding from Hera's wrath, raised in secret by nymphs and satyrs. He learned to survive, to change, to hide his godhood behind a pleasant smile and a wine jug. And like so many who have grown up in exile, he learned how to travel quietly, cleverly, and sometimes deceptively, back to the ship, according to the Homeric hymns, which date back to around the 7th century BCE. Dionysus was walking along the shoreline of a Greek island. Some say it was Icaria when a band of Tyrrhenian pirates saw him. They mistook him for a wealthy young nobleman, someone whose family would pay a fine ransom. Or perhaps they thought he was a wine merchant, his cloak smelling faintly of crushed fruit. In either case, they offered him a ride. He stepped aboard, with the grace of a man who had never feared anything. The pirates quickly tied him to the mast-oar, tried to... The ropes slipped from his wrists, as if his skin were made of oil. They tried again. The knots unraveled before their eyes. Some of the sailors began to worry. Perhaps this was no ordinary man. But the captain stern, scarred, unmoved. Wine began to pool on the deck. At first they thought someone had spilled a jug, but there were no jugs, no leaks. The wine flowed freely across the wooden planks, soaking their sandals and the soles of the ship. Then ivy began to grow from the mast, from the oars, from the benches where the men sat. Tendrils snaked around their ankles. The mast flowered. The stranger stood, no longer smiling. What happened next? The men panicked. They reached for their weapons, but the handles were tangled in vines. One of them cried out that they should stop. The young man was clearly a god in disguise. But others laughed, mocked, refused to kneel. It was too late. He changed. He became a lion, or at least something that looked like one. Ferocious, roaring. bounding across the deck. The pirates leaped overboard in terror, hoping to swim ashore. But the moment they touched the sea, their bodies shifted. Arms thinned, legs melted, skin grew smooth and silver. They were no longer men, they were dolphins. Why? Dolphins. Here's where it gets quietly interesting. In ancient Greek culture, dolphins were seen as protectors of sailors. There are countless stories of shipwrecked travelers being rescued by these sleek creatures. They were seen as playful, joyful, almost divine. So Dionysus's punishment wasn't so much cruel as transformative. He didn't kill the pirates. He changed them into something better, something bound to the sea, but free from greed. This story, tucked into a dusty corner of Greek mythology, offers a rare glimpse into a myth with a sort of soft justice. Dionysus didn't crush his enemies. He repurposed them, and in doing so, he became something more than the god of wine. He became the god of letting go, of surrender, of unexpected kindness. And now, when dolphins swim beside ships, ancient sailors once believed they were those very pirates forever circling the world, reminded of what they could have been had they simply listened. But there's more to Dionysus than this one tale. For a god so often drunk, he was surprisingly purposeful in his wanderings. The god who walked like a stranger, you left the last scene standing on the edge of a ship, salt drying on your skin, watching dolphins slice through the surf. The strange young man who wasn't a man at all had disappeared from view, swallowed by the same sea that had once buoyed him. But Dionysus was far from finished. This section takes us beyond the pirate ship, into the broader and quieter wanderings of Dionysus, because his transformation of pirates into dolphins was just a footnote in a much longer journey, one marked by disguises, forgotten towns, masked festivals, and a divine identity so often rejected that he had to prove himself again and again. You see, Dionysus is one of the only Olympian gods who had to earn his place on Mount Olympus, and he earned it with theater, madness, wine, and walking. The god who didn't belong at first. Most gods in the Greek pantheon arrive with thunderous fanfare. Athena sprang from Zeus's skull, fully armed. Apollo entered Delphi with golden arrows and a musical bow. But Dionysus, he drifted. He wandered across Egypt, Phrygia, India, Thrace, even as far as Libya. In most versions, his journey is called a procession, but that makes it sound ceremonial. It wasn't. It was slow, strange, and deeply human. He was exiled, not by punishment, but by his very nature. Dionysus blurred boundaries between mortal and divine, between sanity and ecstasy, between male and female. In art and sculpture, he often appears androgynous or youthful, never quite solid. To ancient Greeks, whose gods represented clear force, swore love, wisdom, Dionysus was unsettling, and so he walked. What did Dionysus do while wandering? He taught people how to make wine, not the exciting, raucous part, but the actual cultivation, the careful process, pruning vines, fermenting grapes in clay jars, figuring out how to bury the amphorae just deep enough in the soil to keep them cool. There's something surprisingly soothing in imagining a god crouched under the sun, inspecting grape skins for signs of fermentation. He visited remote villages, small ones, nestled in valleys or carved into hillsides, and introduced them to rituals. Some were gentle, planting vines, harvesting communally. Others were wild, masked dances in the woods at night, where people wore animal skins and let go of identity altogether. These rites, later called the Bacchanalia, would become controversial. but in their early form, they were about release, about confronting grief, joy, fear without speaking it aloud. And wherever he went, he brought a kind of quiet rebellion. The tale of Dionysus in Thebes, a town that should have known better nowhere. Was Dionysus more insulted than in Thebes, a city deeply connected to his mortal lineage? His mother Semele had come from Thebes, but even there, he was denied. King Pentheus, whose name now echoes through literary tragedies, refused to acknowledge Dionysus's divinity. He saw the women of the city slipping into the hills at night, following the new god in unexplainable rituals, and feared it. He mocked the worship, declared it lawless. He arrested Dionysus. Except, as is often the case in myth, he didn't know who he was arresting. Dionysus appeared in disguiser, mild stranger with curling hair, soft voice, no weapons. He allowed himself to be bound again, and smiled as the palace doors closed around him that night. Vines grew through the walls of the prison. Fire danced on the roof, then vanished. The chains fell off. Dionysus walked free without touching the door, and still Pentheus would not believe. The quiet, terrifying end of Pentheus Dionysus didn't roar like Ares. He didn't cast thunder like Zeus. His revenge was slow, strange, and dreamlike. He lured Pentheus into dressing as a woman so he could spy on the mysterious rites performed by Theban women on Mount Cithaeron. Dionysus offered to lead him there personally. Pentheus, confused but obsessed, agreed as they approached. The mountain, Dionysus described the rituals, the singing, the dancing, the energy that turned the night electric. Pentheus, hidden in a tree, watched. Then the women saw him, but their minds were not their own. Maddened by divine power, they mistook him for a lion. They pulled him from the branches. They tore him apart. Among them was a own mother. She didn't realize what she had done until the sun rose. Why tell this story in a whispered history podcast? Because in the hush of night, when everything feels safe and still, this myth reveals how fragile social order truly is, and how quickly it can unravel when people stop listening to the quiet forces of grief, wildness, and joy. Dionysus wasn't punishing Pentheus out of cruelty. He was showing what happens when you deny the things people need to feel. Joy, mourning, release, communal ritual, and so, the god of wine wasn't just a bringer of drunken feasts, he was a keeper of balance. A god who knew that sometimes the most dangerous man is the one who refuses to dance. Dionysus and the theatre, his last gift after Thebes. Dionysus didn't rage across the land. He went to Athens, and there they honored him not with fear, but with festivals. They built the theatre of Dionysus, carved into the slope of the Acropolis. Every year, in the spring, they would perform plays, comedies, tragedies, and satyr. Drummers in his name. Imagine it, 15,000 people in the audience, all watching the same story, wearing masks, letting the stage do what ritual once had, help people process the unspoken. Theatre, in this way, became his final temple. He didn't destroy cities. He didn't ask for temples of gold. He just asked to be recognized. And when he finally was, he gave them stories. But Dionysus's journey doesn't end in Athens. He had one more task, one more impossible journey, through a place no other god dared walk. Why would the god of wine and revelry descend into the land of the dead, and who was he hoping to bring back? The descent into the underworld. The night is silent now. The wine has been drunk, the theatre closed, the songs forgotten until next spring. But Dionysus does not sleep. No dash, Unlike the other gods, he does not bask long in glory or settle into comfort, for his journey is not complete. There is one place still untouched by his sandals, one realm even most Olympians dare not enter, tot Hades. And unlike Orpheus, who sang his way down with trembling hands, or Heracles, who stormed through with muscle and madness, Dionysus enters differently, quietly, calmly, a god of life who seeks to walk among the dead, not for conquest, not for theft, but for something far gentler, to bring back a soul. Who was he looking for? The myths don't always agree, which makes them more interesting. Some say his mother, Semele, burned to ashes by Zeus's divine form and lost to the underworld. Others say it was a soul bound to him in mystery cults, perhaps someone unnamed, sacred to his rites. But most traditions center on Semele. It makes sense. Dionysus had always been a god between worlds, mortal born, but divine-blooded, a wanderer, of forests and cities, dreams and madness. To bring back Semele, to raise her from the ash and smoke of death, would be an act of completion. It would stitch together the final divide, not just between mortal and God, but between life and death itself. And so he descends. The katabasis, a journey downward. The Greek term for a descent into the underworld is katabasis. For most, it is a one-way path. But Dionysus, ever the exception, walks down with ivy in his hair and a crown of pine. He brings no sword, no lyre, no army. Instead, he brings wine, according to the Orphic texts, fragments of ancient spiritual poetry whispered in mystery. Cults. Dionysus found the gates of Hades not by breaking them open, but by charming them. His cup was full, his intentions clear. He brought not destruction, but sweetness, sleep, dream, fog. And that's how he passed Cerberus. Not with chains, not with song, but with a bowl gently extended. A god in the realm of the dead. Dionysus didn't walk through the underworld to admire its bleakness. He didn't linger at Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. Nor did he barter long with Hades and Persephone, who knew the rules of the dead were not made to be broken. But Dionysus did not ask for a favor. He offered a trade. In some versions, he brings a mask carved from olive wood. In others, a sprig of ivy dipped in fermented honey. But always, he speaks the same thing. Let her return. Let Semele rise. Let death release her, if only because she had not chosen it, if only because her story is not done. And perhaps the strangest thing of all, Hades agrees. The ascent, a new goddess is born. Semele returns not as the woman who once loved Zeus, but as a goddess reborn. Thyone, spirit of sacred frenzy, joy, and resurrection. She joins her son on Olympus, now fully divine, and Dionysus. He earns his seat among the 12, not by bloodline, not by conquest, but by proving something unique, that even death is not always the end, that there can be rebirth, that things lost can be found, that joy and love and ecstasy aren't distractions from the world, they are part of how we survive it. And this idea that life and death are not enemies but partners would become central to the cults of Dionysus, which quietly spread through Greece and Rome, Egypt and beyond. A god for the outsiders. By the time Dionysus finally rests, he has become something far greater than the god of wine. He is the god of contradictions, of laughter and grief, of masks and truth, of forgetting and remembering, of madness and clarity, of life and afterlife. He is a god for the broken, the joyful, the mourning, the ecstatic, for those who don't fit, for those who wander. for those who seek the in-between spaces of the world and find somehow that they are sacred. And that's why his myths linger long after others fade. Because Dionysus didn't just sit atop a mountain. He walked, he crossed borders, he raised the dead, he forgave pirates, he taught mortals how to let go. So the next time you see a dolphin leap beside a boat, or sip something fermented and sweet, or find yourself laughing through tears, remember, somewhere between the living and the dead, between madness and clarity, Dionysus is still walking. Story 2. Why Hermes invented the first pair of sneakers. Section 1. The god who couldn't sit, still you. Rewalking across a dusty Greek hillside, where the sun bakes the earth in long golden strokes. The crickets are loud. The sheep. You're following footprints, faint in the dirt, unusually small for an adult. But they seem fresh, oddly fresh, and there, backwards. You're not imagining things. The footprints are deliberately reversed, as though the person who made them had turned their sandals around, not to confuse you specifically, but to confuse someone, a pursuer perhaps, a watchful god, or maybe just an older brother. This is the first known prank of Hermes, and the beginning of his story. A baby thief in a cradle. In most myths, gods emerge fully formed. Athena arrives in armor. Apollo plays the lyre before he can speak. But Hermes was born curious. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, he was born at dawn and by midday had already invented a musical instrument. By nightfall, he had stolen a herd of cattle. A full day. One god. About 7 chaotic hours of productivity. The story begins with his birth to Maia, a shy mountain nymph living in a shadowed cave. Maia preferred quiet. Her newborn son did not. Before she could blink, Hermes wriggled out of his swaddling, padded across the cave floor, and climbed into the daylight with something mischievous already glowing in his eyes. His target, Apollo's cattle. But why steal a bunch of cows? It's a fair question. Cattle weren't just animals in ancient Greece, they were currency, prestige, divine property. To steal Apollo's sacred herd was the divine equivalent of sneaking into a god's garage and hot-wiring his favorite chariot. But Hermes didn't want the cows for their meat or milk. He wanted to prove something. He was just hours old, but he wanted a seat at Olympus, a place among the big players. And Hermes knew that in a pantheon full of warriors, thinkers, and kings, he would have to be something else, a trickster, a mover, a whisper in the wind. But he couldn't outrun Apollo barefoot, the world's first sneakers sort of, so Hermes got creative. Before reaching the cattle, he paused, sat cross-legged beside a fallen olive tree, and began crafting, from bark, grass, and clever twists of fiber. Hermes invented what the hymn describes as sandals of woven rushes. Not very flashy, but practical, light, soft, silent. The soles were padded with myrtle leaves, the straps crisscrossed like laces. He wore them not forward, but backward. So when Apollo tracked the trail, he would follow it away from the cave, not toward it. Already, Hermes had shown himself not as a warrior or builder, but as a thinker. One who understood that movement itself could be an illusion, that the world could be tricked into thinking you were somewhere you were not. These sandals, primitive as they were, became the prototype of every traveler's gear. In later stories, Hermes wears winged sandals called talaria, crafted by Hephaestus himself. But these first shoes, these were handmade, earth-grown rookie gear for a rookie guard, and they worked. The great cow high-stander, cover of night, baby Hermes, yes, Still technically, a baby led the cattle across miles of rugged terrain, backward sandaled feet padding, silently across the stones. He drove them through riverbeds to hide their scent. He tied broom branches to their tails to sweep away tracks. He hummed to them. He was kind, and when he reached a small clearing near Pylos, he sacrificed 2 of the cows to the 12 Olympians. But he set aside 1 piece of meat, untouched not for hunger, but for balance, for respect. This wasn't theft. It was negotiation then. He buried the rest of the evidence, smoothed the soil, and tiptoed back to his cradle like nothing had happened. When Apollo stormed into the cave the next morning, golden, furious, his bow vibrating with divine suspicion, Hermes was nestled in his blankets, cooing, "Who, me?" he said, blinking innocently. The calm before the judgment Hermes denied everything. With flair, with confusion, with the smooth logic of someone who understands language better than rules. Apollo, completely unconvinced, dragged him to Zeus for arbitration. Imagine it. A full-grown sun god carrying a squirmy infant god into the marble halls of Olympus, both angry for entirely different reasons, and Zeus. He laughed, not out of mockery, but out of recognition. He saw himself in Hermes, a rule-breaker, a charmer, someone who didn't just live by wit but made wit divine. But still, justice needed to be done. Hermes returned the cattle, and Apollo, he got something far stranger, and far more valuably, return. What did Hermes give Apollo, and why did it change everything? We'll explore the surprising gift Hermes invented in the next part of this myth, a musical instrument never seen before, born from a tortoise shell and some stretched gut strings. It may just be the only time a god has been forgiven for theft with a lullaby. The lyre and the laughing sun god. So here we are, Olympus. On one side stands Apollo, tall and golden, glowing with the sort of radiance that only a sun god or perhaps someone constantly bathed in compliments can possess. He's holding a lyre of his own, its strings taut and gleaming, but it sits unused in his hand. His jaw is clenched, his voice sharp. Across from him, swaddled in a loose wrap of goat wool and half grinning, is Hermes, barely a day old. He dangles his little feet and hums to himself. Between them, Zeus, king of the gods, beard like a thundercloud, eyes twinkling, not with lightning, but with genuine amusement. He knows something important is happening. He just doesn't know what it is yet. The drama of the great cow heist is finished. The evidence, buried, butchered, or walked backward out of sight. Apollo wants justice. Hermes, somehow, still has tricks in his pocket, and then he reaches into his blanket and pulls out something no god had ever seen before. The lyre made of a tortoise somewhere between cow wrangling and pretending to nap. Hermes had found a tortoise. Now, to most people, or gods, this is not a moment of revelation. But to Hermes, it was inspiration. He examined the shell, hollowed it out, strung it with sinew pulled from the sacrificed cattle, attached a crossbar, added tuning pegs, and just like that, he created the lyre. It was a strange, twangy thing, at first raw and not yet refined. But when Hermes plucked the strings, something ancient stirred in the air. Notes curled like ivy around the ears of Olympus. Melody slid between columns. For the first time, the gods heard harmony, rhythm, structure, emotion, arranged. Apollo, despite himself, leaned in, a gift instead of a grudge. Hermes, still small enough to be carried in a sling, offered the lyre to Apollo with both hands. "Here," he said, "take this in exchange for your cows." And Apollo, he took it, not grudgingly, not out of divine politeness, but with fascination. He plucked the strings once, twice, and, within moments, began to compose hymns, poems, odes. The music of Olympus began here, with this exchange between a dead trickster and a god of prophecy. Hermes, meanwhile, shrugged like it was nothing, and in that moment, a bond was formed between movement and sound, between speed and stillness. Apollo would become known for his musical genius, his poetic insight, but Hermes would always be remembered as the god who gave that gift, who invented art from a shell and strings. What happens when a trickster is rewarded? Zeus, delighted, decided it was time to give Hermes a job, but not a punishment, a purpose. Hermes would become the messenger of the gods, the only Olympian allowed to travel between worlds, from the heights of Olympus to the depths of Hades, and even across the mortal earth. His winged sandals, perfected later by Hephaestus, would become symbols of divine motion, of fast thinking, fast walking, and never staying still. He would also become the god of boundaries of roads, of transitions, of language and trade, of luck and theft, not because he broke rules, but because he understood them too well to be trapped by them. And so, the infant god, barely a day into his divine existence, became one of the most important Olympians, not through force or lineage, but through charm, invention, and a very good pair of handmade sandals. But let's not forget the sandals themselves. The ancient Greeks didn't wear shoes casually. Sandals were practical, but also symbolic of status, of readiness, of citizenship. And Hermes' sandals were the first ones made, not to protect feet, but to leave no trace. They were the ancestor of every spy boot, every magician's trick sole, every messenger's sprint. The idea that your movement could be intentional, deceptive, meaningful, that began with Hermes. Later depictions gave him talaria, ornate and winged, but the first pair, just grass and olive bark, shaped with clever fingers. They were the start of every story that moves. The first peaceful trade among gods. Hermes and Apollo didn't just reconcile, they collaborated. In later stories, Apollo gives Hermes a golden staff, the caduceus, with two snakes entwined around it, now mistakenly used as a symbol of medicine. It was a symbol of negotiation, of safe passage, of harmony between opposites. Hermes would carry it through the worlds, always moving. Even now, modern commerce, communication, and connection are traced back, at least mythically, to this myth. The baby who couldn't sit still, the thief who paid with music, the god who walked backward just to move forward. But there's one part still unanswered. Hermes became messenger to Olympus and guide to the underworld. But how exactly did he earn the title of Psychopompes, escort of souls? Why was he, of all gods, the one chosen to accompany mortals into the land of the dead? We'll follow him to the edge of mortality itself in the final section of this story. Guide of souls and keeper of crossroads, the road is quiet now. No hoofbeats, no lyres, just the soft scuff of sandals over packed earth. You're walking under a twilight sky, somewhere between villages too, late for travel, too early for sleep. At a fork in the path, you notice a pile of small stones with a carved head perched on top, a bearded figure grinning faintly. You've found a Herma boundary marker. Ancient travelers left offerings here, hoping for safe passage, guidance, maybe luck. Because this statue, It's not just decorative, it's dedicated to Hermes, but not the mischievous baby. Not the cow thief, not even the lyre giver. This is a different Hermes, older, still smiling, but quieter. The one who walks between this world and the next. The psychopomp. What is a psychopomp anyway? The word comes from Greek, psyche soul. Pompo's guide. A psychopomp is not a judge, not a punisher, not even a comforter, really. Just a companion. Someone who escorts the dead from life into death, not into the afterlife. Itself that's Hades' realm, but to its door. Most gods avoided the dead. Hermes embraced them, but why? Why would the god of commerce, language, and travel take on such a somber role? The answer lies in movement. Hermes, the boundary walker Hermes, was never a god of permanence. His domain was not Olympus's high halls, nor the fixed altars of stone temples. He lived on the edges between countries, between statuses, between waking and dreaming, and death. Death is the final boundary, the one no mortal returns from, the ultimate transition. It made sense that the god of crossings, of messages, of tiny clever footsteps, would be the one to gently lead souls across that final threshold. He didn't carry a sword or a torch. He carried a staff, the caduceus, not to command, but to signal peaceful passage. The journey of a soul in ancient Greece. When someone died in ancient Greece, their family performed elaborate rituals, washing the body, placing coins over the eyes or in the mouth to pay Coron, the ferryman of the dead. But long before the soul reached the river Styx, it had to be guided, and that's where Hermes came in. He didn't speak much on these journeys, at least not in myth. He walked ahead, perhaps glancing back now and then. Not rushing, not dragging, just there, a companion when no one else could be. To the Greeks, this was reassurance, that even in death, you would not be alone. A god for every kind of traveler. What's remarkable about Hermes is how many roles he took on. Unlike Zeus, who thundered from his throne, or Ares, who charged into war, Hermes could appear in disguise. As a beggar, a merchant, a shepherd, a messenger, even a small breeze carrying a whispered thought. He was the god of transitions. No transition is bigger than death. But his presence was never grim. Even in funerary art, Hermes is serene. Watchful, sometimes leading children, sometimes warriors, sometimes old men, always with the same calm expression, always heading toward the edge of the known. Hermes in the myths of death, in the Odyssey. When the suitors are finally slain, Homer writes that Hermes gathered their souls, holding his staff, and led them down to Hades. In other versions of the myth, he accompanies Orpheus on his failed rescue mission for Eurydice, or whispers to Persephone as she rises for her half-year above ground. But he never interferes, never judges. Hermes is not the god of fate, only of motion, and in that, he offers something surprisingly gentle, the promise that your final journey is not without company. The road never ends even now. The image of Hermes lives on in more than statues, road signs, border checkpoints, first steps, final moments. His sandals, once woven from rushes, are now imagined with feathers, but the idea remains. Light steps, moving forward, always. In modern psychology, Hermes is seen as an archetype, the guide, the boundary crosser, the one who dances between realities. In medicine, the caduceus erroneously adopted as a healing Symbol still bears his mark, and in every myth, his gift is not power, but passage. He gets you there. So why did Hermes invent the first sneakers? Because the world is always moving. Because people get lost. Because the gods were too loud, and someone had to whisper directions. Because sometimes the most sacred gift isn't war or wisdom, but a way forward. And in the end, perhaps Hermes invented more than shoes. Perhaps he invented the idea that no path, no matter how strange or sad, should ever be walked alone. Story 3. How Hestia quietly ran Olympus while everyone else was fighting. Section 1. The hearth that held the heavens ear in an ancient house. The walls are made of sun-dried brick, and the roof is low, held up by wooden beams. The scent of olive oil and smoke lingers in the air. In the very center of the home, not the kitchen, not the bedroom, there's a fire. Not a roaring blaze, but a steady, glowing hearth. Someone stirs it gently, humming a low, peaceful tune. That fire, that's Hestia. And while she doesn't thunder like Zeus, storm like Poseidon, or rage like Ares, she does something much more important. She stays. The first Olympian in most myths, Hestia is barely mentioned. No grand feuds, no tragic love stories, no epic battles. She doesn't kidnap, seduce, transform, or punish. She simply exists. And yet, she was the firstborn of the Olympians, daughter of Cronus and Rhea, and, depending on how you count, the last-born, too, since Cronus swallowed all his children, and Hestia was the first in and the last out. This ironic loop suits her. She's always there, quietly bookending the chaos. When Zeus overthrew Cronus, Hestia could have claimed any role she wanted, goddess of the skies, of war, of magic. But instead, she asked for the hearth. Why? Because someone had to keep the fire burning. What was the hearth in ancient Greece? In ancient Greek homes, the hearth wasn't just for cooking. It was the heart of the house, literally and symbolically. Newborns were introduced to it. Oaths were sworn by it. Guests were seated near it. Offerings to the gods were made through its flames. In city-states, the hearth wasn't just a private feature. There was a public hearth too, at the center of civic life. When colonists founded a new city, they carried a flame from their homeland's hearth to light the new one. This wasn't just symbolism. It was Hestia carried, preserved, honored. Even temples to other gods had a space for her. Flame. She was never the main show, but she was always present. Hestia's quiet power. She didn't fight in the Titamachi, didn't meddle in mortal lives, didn't father demigods or fling thunderbolts. But when the rest of Olympus bickered and schemed, Hestia stayed neutral. When Aphrodite sparked feuds over beauty, Hestia stayed unmarried. When Dionysus spread chaos, Hestia stayed grounded. She was the goddess of stillness and constant care, and that wasn't weakness. That was strategy, because someone had to watch the fire, while everyone else went chasing storms. The one who said no. It's rare for Greek goddesses to say no, but Hestia, she said it twice. To Poseidon and Apollo, no less two of Olympus's most powerful gods. They both proposed to her, but Hestia refused. Not out of disdain, not because she hated men, or marriage, or love, but because she had already chosen a vow, chastity, and service at the hearth. And so Zeus granted her a rare honor. She would remain eternally virgin, untouched and undisturbed. No one would force her. No one would steal her away to the underworld. No golden apples would be tossed in her name. She was too important for drama. Hestia in myth, or the lack thereof, it's ironic. Hestia, goddess of story-centered rituals, like hospitality and birth, has almost no stories herself, no wild adventures, no songs or tragedies, and that's precisely why she endured, while the stories of jealous gods and cursed lovers made for thrilling epics. Hestia's presence remained constant. Not dramatic, not loud, just dependable, which, in a way, makes her more powerful than all the others. While they fought, plotted, and fell out of favor, Hestia remained beloved, trusted after all. When you're cold, hungry, and lost, who do you pray to? Not Zeus, not Artemis. You pray to the hearth, a thought to warm by. So, when people say Hestia did nothing, they miss the point. She wasn't idle. She was holding everything together. Olympus needed thunder, it needed wine, it needed war. But none of it could exist without a center of flame to return to, and Hestia, she was that flame. The goddess without a temple, sort of. You return now to that steady flame. It hasn't moved, it hasn't flickered. While chaos roars outside, floods, famines, love affairs gone awry, the hearth remains lit, and Hestia, patient as ever, tends it. But here's something strange. For the goddess who was present in every home, Hestia had no temple of her own in most cities, at least not in the grand columned, statue-filled way we think of temples. Instead, her sacred space was simpler, quieter, a flame, a circle of stones, a clay brazier in a family's courtyard. And maybe that was the point. Sacred, but not showy. In ancient Greece, gods got temples, big ones. Think of the Parthenon in Athens for Athena, the oracle's temple at Delphi for Apollo, or the colossal statue of Zeus at Olympia. But Hestia, her temple was any hearth, anywhere, in homes, in city halls, in the center of town. The Prytaneum, a kind of civic hearth house, existed in almost every city-state. It was a public building where ambassadors dined, laws were recorded, and the sacred fire of Hestia burned eternally. So while she had no big monuments, she was everywhere, omnipresent in the plainest places. That kind of subtle, constant worship isn't glamorous, but it's powerful. The keeper of guests and oaths. Hestia's hearth wasn't just for warmth and cooking. It was also about hospitality. In a time before hotels and Airbnbs, hospitality was sacred. To host someone meant safety, food, peace, and the hearth was where that happened. This wasn't just cultural, it was divine. To mistreat a guest was to offend Hestia herself. When oaths were sworn, alliances, marriages, peace treaties, they were made beside the hearth, not because the fire was magical, but because it was honest, plain, steady. You didn't swear a lie beside Hestia's fire. You'd feel it. Maybe it was the way the flames hissed. Or maybe it was just conscience, the forgotten flame of Rome now. Let's shift our view westward toward Rome, because the Romans didn't forget Hestia. They renamed her Vesta and gave her a very prominent place in the Temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. A sacred fire was kept burning by the Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to chastity and duty, unlike Greece. Rome gave Vesta an actual temple, round in shape like the hearth, modest in decoration, but central in meaning. If the flame went out, it was considered a terrible, ominous sign of state failure. Sometimes it meant bad harvests, disease, or war, the entire fate of the Roman Empire. In some sense, rested on that one fire, the Vestal virgins. Rome's quiet powerhouse. These women weren't just ceremonial firekeepers. They were powerful, revered, and feared. They could pardon criminals, own property, and had front-row seats at games and rituals. For 30 years, they served Vesta 10 in training, 10 in service, 10 in teaching. But if they broke their vow of chastity, they were buried alive, gently, of course, with food and water, so no one could say they were executed. Rome had a way of making even quiet religion sound ominous, still. These priestesses embodied Hestia's ideal: purity, constancy, service, and their sacred charge, just to keep the flame burning. The myth Hestia never needed other gods were complicated. Their stories were messy, full of transformations, betrayals, dramatic irony. But Hestia, she needed no myth to make her meaningful. Her presence was self-evident. After all, you could see her flame. You could feel her warmth. You didn't need a bard to explain her. She was part of your every meal, your every winter, your every welcome. Her worship required no spectacle, no human sacrifice, just a little kindling, a little breath, and respect. A moment beside the firing. Now you're a traveler, arriving at a stranger's door. You're cold, wet, hungry. They usher you in, not to the dining table, not to the bedroom, but to the hearth. They give you bread, wine, dry your clothes, say nothing of your name. That quiet moment, that unspoken kindness, that's Hestia. A thought to sit with so when ancient people lit their hearth each morning. It wasn't just routine, it was ritual, it was remembrance, and it was a way of saying, let this home be steady, let it be safe, let it be sacred. And at the center of it all, unseen and unheralded, sat a goddess who never left her post. The one who stepped aside by now, you know, Hestia, the quiet one, the one who tended the fire while the others were out throwing lightning bolts, seducing mortals, waging divine wars, or stealing each other's sacred animals. She was there always, but in the background now we come to her final act. Not a battle, not a scandal, just a choice. And perhaps the most powerful one a god ever made on Mount Olympus. She gave up her throne. 12 Olympians. One to many you've probably heard of the 12 Olympians, the core gods of the Greek pantheon. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hermes, Hephaestus, and Hestia. Except not always, because at some point Dionysus, the god of wine theatre and very poor decision-making, joined the party. And there were only 12 thrones on Olympus. Now. Imagine the drama. Gods don't share. They don't scoot over. The throne room of Olympus was as much about ego as power. So what happened? Hestia stepped aside. She gave up her seat so that Dionysus could have one. No war, no shouting, no thunderbolts. Just a quiet exit. Why would a goddess give up power? That question bothered ancient writers. They didn't like the idea of someone willingly relinquishing status, especially not a goddess. Not in a world where immortality and hierarchy were everything, but it made sense. Hestia didn't need the throne. She didn't want followers for vanity. She didn't need a golden chariot or an army of griffins. She was already in every hearth, in every home. Her worship didn't depend on Olympus. If anything, she was more powerful for stepping back. She became the goddess who ruled without needing to be seen, the goddess of no, in a way. Hestia is the goddess of boundaries. She's the one who said no to drama. Number 2, the throne, and most famously no to marriage. To major gods, courted her, Apollo, the golden boy, and Poseidon, the sea king. She turned them both down. Politely, firmly, Finally, she asked Zeus to swear an oath that she would remain a virgin forever, untouched by marriage or romantic entanglements, and he agreed. While other gods complicated their lives with divine children, jealous lovers, and personal feuds, Hestia remained whole. That wasn't weakness, that was sovereignty. Hestia's disappearance and her return as centuries passed. Hestia's name faded. She didn't have wild myths to retell. No tragedies or epic fights. Just warmth, fire, food. The things we stop noticing when they're constant. By the time Roman emperors turned toward Christianity, Vesta's temples were shuttered. The Vestal virgins were disbanded. The eternal flame was snuffed out in 394 CE. By order of Theodosius, it had burned for over 1,100 years. But did that mean Hestia was gone? Not really, because long after the statues fell and the priests scattered, people still lit fires, still gathered in circles, still whispered stories in the glow of coals, and in that quiet return to warmth and simplicity she was still there, Hestia. In the modern world today, no one offers libations to Hestia before dinner. But think about this. Every time someone turns on a stove, lights a candle during a storm, makes tea for a friend, invites someone in from the cold, that's Hestia, not as a goddess to worship, but as a principle, a gentle guide. She lives in nursing homes, in kitchen tables, in late-night talks by the fireplace, in boundaries kept and kindness given without drama. She is the goddess of soft power, of not needing credit, of making space for others, and in a world loud with performance. That kind of quiet might be the most powerful presence of all. A final reflection. So, the next time you feel the pull to rise, to shout, to be seen, pause. Picture a woman by a fire. She isn't moving, she isn't speaking, but everything around her works because of her. And maybe, just maybe, that's what true influence looks like. Story 4. The time Croesus misunderstood an oracle and lost everything. The richest man in the world. You've probably heard the saying, as rich as Croesus. It's an old expression, one that still lingers in dusty books and crossword clues. But who was this Croesus really? Was he just another king with too much gold and not enough sense? Actually, yes. But the story is more soothing than it sounds. So get comfortable. Picture a gentle Anatolian landscape, the hills of ancient Lydia, the trickling of the Pactolus River, and a king who, while surrounded by luxury, was perhaps not quite as clever as he believed. Let's begin. Lydia, a land of gold and glory long before Turkey was called Turkey. It was home to the Lydians, a wealthy kingdom in western Anatolia. Lydia was famous for two things: being the first civilization to mint coins made of precious metals, having so much gold that the river literally glittered. The Pactolus River, which ran through the Lydian capital of Sardis, carried gold, dust said, to have come from the sands left by King Midas after he washed away his golden touch there. And ruling over all this was Croesus, the last king of Lydia before Persia swallowed it whole. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. At the time of our story, around 560 BCE, Croesus had just come to power. He was fabulously wealthy, fabulously confident, and very interested in knowing one thing: would he win if he went to war against Persia? The oracles of the ancient world in ancient times. If you were about to make a big decision, go to war, plant a new crop, marry your daughter off to a prince, you'd consult an oracle. And if you were especially wealthy, like Croesus, you didn't settle for just one oracle. You tested all of them. Croesus sent envoys to Delphi, Dodona, Ammon in Libya, Branchidae, and other temples, each with the same clever riddle. He told them to ask their gods what Croesus was doing at a specific moment. Only the oracle at Delphi answered correctly. He is boiling a tortoise and a lamb in a bronze pot. He was impressed. Croesus decided the Delphic oracle was legitimate. Now he was ready to ask the real question. If I go to war against Persia, will I win? The Pythias answer was classically vague. If you cross the river Halys, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus was delighted. That sounded like a yes. He gathered his army, marched to the border, and crossed the river. Spoiler, it was his own empire's. Croesus did destroy a great empire, just not the one he meant to. He lost, spectacularly. The Persian king, Cyrus the Great, was not only a brilliant strategist, he was also great at winning hearts. When he defeated Croesus, he didn't execute him. Instead, he kept him alive and even made him a trusted advisor. But let's not jump to the ending yet. At this point, Croesus still thought he was clever. He had interpreted the prophecy the way he wanted. After all, whoever thinks the great empire being destroyed will be their own. But history has a quiet way of humbling the powerful. The delicate art of misinterpretation. Croesus's mistake wasn't uncommon. Ancient oracles always gave ambiguous answers, often in poetic riddles. This wasn't just mysticism, it was survival. If your words could be interpreted multiple ways, you were never technically wrong. But Croesus didn't want nuance. He wanted confirmation. And so he read certainty into a sentence that was never meant to be certain. It's a classic human habit, isn't it? Even now, we ask questions looking for the answer we want, not the truth. But back then, for a king, a misread sentence could mean the end of a civilization. Life in Sardis, before the fall. Let's pause here and step inside the palace of Sardis. It's easy to picture a typical ancient city as dusty and austere. But Sardis was different. Its buildings were opulent. Croesus's court was filled with artists, poets, philosophers. He invited thinkers from across the known world, including a grizzled old man named Solon, an Athenian lawmaker. Legend says, Croesus showed Solon all his treasures and asked who is the happiest man in the world, expecting his own name in reply. Croesus was surprised when Solon listed unknown peasantsmen who had lived honorable lives and died peacefully. Croesus scoffed. What did Solon know? But that story will take on new meaning soon enough. A king on the edge of destiny. As Croesus prepared his invasion, the pieces were already moving on the board. Persia was rising, Lydia was growing arrogant, and the river Halys, once just a peaceful border, was about to become a line crossed. And so we leave Croesus here, on the verge of battle, confident, surrounded by riches, backed by an oracle. He believes he is about to win glory, but history knows otherwise. The empire that Croesus destroyed was his own. So we return to Croesus, the golden king of Lydia, flush with confidence after receiving the Delphic oracle's cryptic blessing. He had asked whether he should go to war with the Persians. The oracle answered, if you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great empire. Croesus, who had never lost a battle, who bathed in the gold-rich waters of the Pactolus, who measured success in coins and chariots, was sure he understood the message, and so, with drums echoing softly against the Anatolian foothills, Croesus set out to destroy Persia instead. he marched toward the destruction of his own empire with the same calm assurance of a man walking into his own banquet hall. Let's walk with him. The road to war in 547 BCE. The Halys River marked the eastern boundary of Lydia. Beyond it stretched the Persian Empire, massive, rising, and led by Cyrus the Great, who had already conquered the Medes and was uniting the peoples of the East under one clever crown. Croesus, no fool militarily, began by allying with the Babylonians, Spartans, and Egyptians, forming what looked like a formidable anti-Persian bloc. He also brought his troops into Cappadocia, a rugged land of cliffs and plateaus technically Persian territory. He engaged in what historians now call the Battle of Petria. It was by most standards a draw, but in the sleepier corners of ancient warfare, that meant Croesus withdrew for winter, assuming Cyrus would do the same. In Sardis, Croesus dismissed his mercenaries and sent home many of his soldiers. Winter, after all, was for rest and banquets, not campaigning. Unfortunately, Cyrus had other plans. Cyrus the not so slippy. Instead of retreating, Cyrus pursued. He crossed the same river that Croesus had once crossed, advancing deep into Lydia at an unexpected pace. It must have felt surreal for Croesus, sitting in his marble halls, sipping honeyed wine, to hear that Cyrus was outside the gates of Sardis already, and Cyrus wasn't alone. His forces were battle-hardened and diverse Medes, Persians, and cavalry units that could outmaneuver the famously strong but heavy Lydian horsemen. Croesus had misjudged the rules of the game, and worse, he had misread Cyrus's character. Where Croesus expected old-fashioned court politeness, he got bold, mobile warfare and relentless siege tactics. The final stand, the Battle of Thymbraeon, last battle unfolded outside Sardis, at a place called Thymbra. Croesus's war elephants and cavalry took the field with grandeur. Cyrus, however, arranged his troops in a curious formation. With camels at the front. It turns out horses hate the smell of camels. As the Lydian cavalry charged, their horses panicked and scattered. The entire military strategy Croesus had banked on was undone by the odd biological aversion of horses to camels' scent. The Lydians were routed. Sardis was besieged, and within 14 days, one of the richest cities in the known world fell. The fire and the mercy hears, where things could have turned tragical. Perhaps they did, in their own quiet way. After his defeat, Croesus was captured. He was, according to Herodotus, placed atop a funeral pyre by Cyrus, who either wanted to honor him like a warrior or just be rid of him. As the flames rose, Croesus reportedly cried out, "Solon, Solon, Solon," the same Solon who once told him that no man should be called happy until after death, because fortune can change in a blink. Cyrus, curious, asked what the name meant. Croesus explained. And so says the story, Cyrus, moved by the wisdom and fall of his foe, ordered the flames extinguished. Croesus survived. And far from being executed, he was made a counselor to Cyrus, his enemy turned emperor. A fall measured in coins. In the end, Croesus lost everything that glittered: his kingdom, his army, his reputation as the golden genius. But he gained something odd in return: a long second act. Not many defeated kings go on to advise their conquerors. Fewer still live long enough to be remembered not as tragic figures, but as cautionary tales wrapped in calm parables. The Delphic oracle wasn't wrong, of course. Croesus did destroy a great empire, just not the one he intended. But how did Croesus's own advisors, soldiers, and people react to this sudden fall from wealth to servitude? What became of Sardis under Persian rule, and what legacy did Croesus leave behind? Croesus in captivity, from king of gold to Persian advisor. When a king falls, the story often ends. But with Croesus, the real intrigue began after the defeat. His kingdom gone, his army scattered, and his city swallowed into the vast Persian empire. Yet Croesus, by some mixture of wit, luck, and pathos, survived. This third and final section explores Croesus not as a conqueror or builder of temples, but as something far more delicate, a man who had lost everything but still had something to offer. What happens to a man who once measured his wealth in rivers of gold, now living under the roof of the man who took it all? Life after fire. There is a calmness to Croesus's story now. No more cavalry charges, no more oracles to consult. In his old age, Croesus became what few kings ever live long enough to become, a former king. He wasn't thrown into chains. He wasn't exiled to rot in a mountain prison. Instead, Cyrus the Great, ever the strategist, saw value in keeping Croesus alive, not just alive, but nearby. He made him a royal counselor, a sort of advisor emeritus, who could provide insight into the western edge of the empire. Croesus knew the customs of the Greeks, the politics of the Ionian cities, and the language of the Lydians. He was fluent in the things that Cyrus still needed to learn. So Croesus stayed, an old man with a trimmed beard and tired eyes, in the glittering new capital of Pasargadae, a long way from Sardis. Croesus's advice sometimes ignored. Ever the collector of unlikely stories tells us that Croesus did offer guidance, but it wasn't always heeded. One tale tells of Cyrus preparing to sack a river-rich city, perhaps Babylon. Cyrus, eager for conquest, ignored Croesus's advice to treat the people with mercy and restraint. Later, the decision would backfire. Citizens rebelled, or infrastructure was damaged. And Croesus, with the soft-spoken boldness only the powerless can afford, is said to have told Cyrus, "You do not heed the advice of one who has seen the wheel of fortune turn." It's a quiet reprimand, gently phrased, free of anger, but potent nonetheless. Croesus had learned the hard way that power is temporary, and that pride before the flame leads not to glory, but to reflection on cold stone floors. Croesus and the oracle revisited as years passed. Croesus never quite let go of Delphi. After his fall, he is said to have sent envoys back to the oracle, demanding to know why he had been so cruelly misled. The priests of Apollo answered in typically enigmatic fashion, "You were told you would destroy a great empire. You did, it was your own." No apology, no correction, just a quiet reminder that truth, in Delphi, often arrived dressed in riddles. Croesus reportedly accepted this with grace. He had asked a question and received an answer. The error was not in the oracle's words, but in his interpretation. This admission, simple, profound, marks the moment Croesus transforms from a fallen king into a philosopher of fate. Legacy in Lydia, and beyond, back in Sardis. Now a Persian satrapy, life resumed. Under new management, Croesus's temples remained standing. His coinage, those first stamped coins of precious metal, continued to circulate, and people still spoke his name. Though not as a monarch to the Greeks, he became a tragic figure of literature, symbol of hubris and reversal. To the Persians, he was a quiet warning, even the Golden King's fall, and to future historians, Croesus would be a benchmark not for wealth, but for the limits of wealth. You could conquer lands, you could weigh your fortune in talents of silver. But if you misunderstood one sentence from a woman in a stone temple on a mountain, that fortune could vanish in a puff of wood smoke. Reflections from a quiet place, so picture Croesus in his final days. Not on a battlefield, not in a treasury, but in a shaded courtyard of a Persian palace. Running his fingers along the smooth lip of a bronze bowl, his mind adrift in memory. He remembers the glint of Sardis at dawn, the feel of the first gold coin he ever stamped, the moment when his horses bucked at the scent of camels, the name Solon echoing in Firelight, and perhaps he smiles, not bitterly, but wisely, because in the end, Croesus had something rarer than gold: perspective.